They asked Casey to take our Thanksgiving group photo, then cropped me out before posting. Willa Dean 57 Waitress scar and all. The coffee had gone cold, the fluorescent light hummed too loud, and that ribbon in my pocket still folded sharp. Ever wonder how long someone can stay invisible? Every morning before dawn, Willa Dean unlocked Dixie's diner, brewed the first pot of black coffee, and disappeared into the hum of frying bacon and forgotten names. The key made its usual soft click in the door, and Willa stepped into the quiet. Darkness still clung to the town of Franklin, Tennessee, and the sky outside hadn't yet made up its mind whether it wanted to be blue or gray. She moved without hurry, switching on the soft overheads, adjusting the blinds a quarter open, flipping the closed sign so it showed "Open soon" in faded red. The floor creaked under her sturdy shoes as she walked the linoleum path she knew better than her own breath. She filled the urn, measured the grounds without needing to look, and let the scent of the day's first brew begin its slow, steady claim on the air. A scratchy voice floated out from the AM radio behind the register, the weather guy from Nashville forecasting another chilly morning with a chance of drizzle by evening. As the first notes of a Merle Haggard tune came through the static, Willa hummed along just a little while, setting the silverware in rows that lined up like parade soldiers. Outside, the street lamps blinked tiredly. The war memorial across Main Street stood still under the glow, its stone edges softened by leaves that had drifted against its base. Willa glanced at it once, then returned to folding napkins, her hands working with quiet precision. By 6:15, Casey blew in like wind through a screen door apron, half-tied, cheeks pink from the cold earbuds still hanging from her phone. "Beat me again, huh?" she said, shrugging out of her hoodie. "One of these days I'm gonna get here before you." Willa offered no reply. She bent to retrieve a basket of bread rolls from the back counter, the creak in her knees more noticeable this morning. "Guess not today," Casey added with a little laugh, already tapping on the coffee machine for her own fix. As 7 o'clock neared, the town's usual crowd began to shuffle in boots, tracking in a little road, salt jackets, shaking off wind hands, rubbing together for warmth. The diner bell chimed its two-note greeting each time. Mr. Halloran from the hardware store slid into his corner booth. Agnes from the post office joined her sister at the window seat. Most of them smiled at Casey. A few nodded in Willa's general direction, never directly. Some didn't bother. Willa moved smoothly from table to table. She poured coffee without asking, replaced sugar caddies before anyone noticed they were low. She knew which regular liked jam and which hated pickles. She didn't ask questions and rarely answered any. Midway through clearing table 4, a customer leaned sideways and nudged Casey with a smirk. What happened to the quiet one's face? His voice wasn't cruel, just careless, loud enough for Willa to hear. Casey gave a shrug, kept chewing her gum. Willa kept her back straight. She returned to the counter, set the dishes in the bin, and wiped her hands on her apron with the same rhythm she always did. She picked up a plate of hot buttered biscuits, dropped one off at Mr. Halloran's booth with a soft nod, and kept moving. She didn't flinch. At one point, as she leaned to refill a sugar jar, her coat tugged slightly and a strip of deep purple emerged from her left pocket, a ribbon, faded but neatly pressed, poking just past the edge of the cloth. It caught the light briefly, then was gone when she straightened. The hiss of the griddle, the shuffle of menus, the clink of spoon against ceramic, it all played on. Conversations buzzed and dipped like radio static. Across the room, an elderly man at the far table, someone no one else seemed to know, lifted his cup as Willa passed. His voice was low, clear, and steady. "Thank you, ma'am." Willa paused mid-step. It was the first ma'am she'd heard in weeks that didn't sound like routine or reflex. She gave the faintest nod and moved on. He didn't drink his coffee. He watched the reflection of Willa moving across the window glass. Thursday morning meant biscuits with gravy and half the town's veterans occupying booth space like it was tactical ground. The rain had started just before dawn, a steady patter that glazed the windows of Dixie's diner and glossed the sidewalks outside. Cars rolled by with tires whispering through puddles, and umbrellas bloomed like slow-motion fireworks along Main Street. Inside, the warmth rose in soft plumes from coffee mugs, and the smell of sausage and biscuits mingled with the musk of damp wool coats and old leather jackets. The chalkboard by the door bore Casey's quick, blocky handwriting, "Free coffee for veterans." "Thank you," smudged a little in the corner where someone had shut the door with a wet sleeve. The bell over the entrance jingled in 2s and 3s as they arrived, ball caps stitched with unit patches, shoulders stiff with habit, stories coiled tight behind quiet eyes. Willa moved between booths with practiced grace, her apron strings tied in the same knot she always used. Her hair was pulled back, and the purple ribbon in her coat pocket peaked just slightly as she leaned to wipe a table or reach for a coffee pot. Most didn't see it. Some did and dismissed it. But not all. Commander Everett Boone stepped through the door just after 7. He was nearly 70, but his frame held the echo of posture trained by decades. His buzzed gray hair bristled with the damp, and he wore a dark windbreaker over a pressed-collared shirt. His eyes scanned the room once, not rushed, not casual, before he greeted Mr. Clyde with a nod and a handshake that ended in a familiar squeeze. "Still serving this weak stuff," Clyde Boone said, gesturing toward the urn. "Wouldn't be Thursday without it," Clyde replied. He tipped his chin toward the corner booth, already half filled with Boone's old unit. Boone slid in beside a broad-shouldered man whose jacket bore the faint outline of a 101st Airborne patch. The table filled quickly with low chatter jokes about aging knees and lost bets, and a round of teasing over who still had hair and who ought to stop pretending. Willa brought over the first round of coffees without asking. One of the vets, a man named Petrowski, joked as she set his cup down. "Y'all realize we've survived firefights, road bombs, and chow hall chili, but this coffee might be what finally takes us out." The others chuckled. Willa said nothing, just moved on to the next booth. Boone didn't laugh. His gaze followed her quietly. He watched as she nodded at a woman wiping rain from her glasses near the window, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. The woman didn't return the nod. When Willa passed by his table again, Boone saw the ribbon. It wasn't bright. It wasn't polished or proud. Just a thread of service purple, creased and fading like something carried not for others to see, but so she'd remember it herself. "She's got a face that's seen some stuff, huh?" one of the vets murmured after Willa walked away. Boone looked at the man, then back toward Willa. Casey passed behind the counter, wiping her hands on a damp towel. She didn't answer. Boone's eyes narrowed. He reached into his jacket pocket, drawing out a small, folded square of paper. The edges were worn smooth from years of folding. He opened it carefully on the table, revealing a portion of a hand-marked military map. Coordinates scribbled in pencil notes fading at the creases. His thumb stopped on 2 letters written near a shift in the rote WD. He folded the paper again and slipped it away. Then he stood and crossed to the register. "Dean," he said quietly to Clyde without preamble. Her name. Clyde, still refilling the sugar jar, looked up. "Willa Dean," he said. "Just Dean, if you ask her." Boone gave a single nod. He returned to his booth, sat down, and watched as Willa refilled the creamers near the back counter. When she made her way around to his table, she poured without speaking. He looked up steady. "You ever spend time with Bravo Group?" She froze, barely a breath, but it was there. "Just coffee, sir," she said. Her voice was even, not sharp, not soft. He nodded once, no further questions. Willa walked away. Boone waited until she was across the room, then said softly to himself, "I knew it." By Sunday morning, the weather cleared, but the air in the diner was thick with things unsaid. Sunlight glinted off the wet sidewalks of Franklin, Tennessee, giving the town a brief shimmer as if someone had polished the streets just for church. The bell over Dixie's diner chimed with its usual greeting softer under the cold that clung to coat collars and gloved fingertips. Parishioners came in 2s and 4s coats over arm Bibles tucked under elbows, murmuring blessings to neighbors and nodding at the smell of eggs, bacon, and buttermilk biscuits already filling the room. A small American flag stood quietly in the window by the cash register, its corners twitching each time the door swung open. Boone had arrived before most of them. He sat in the same booth as Thursday, in the same posture, back straight, hands resting on the table. His cup of coffee sat untouched. He wore a different jacket, dark wool this time, buttoned high. Outside, the sun had returned, but in here time ticked slower, as if the warmth were not quite ready to settle in. Willa moved like always. Her steps didn't change. Her expression didn't shift. The coffee pot in her hand made slow arcs as she visited each booth, nodding without words, catching empty mugs with a glance. Her eyes skimmed Boone's table once as she passed toward the kitchen. She didn't stop. He waited. The diner filled steadily, Mr. and Mrs. Simmons in their usual corner, the Whitfields chatting softly at the window. A radio behind the register played soft gospel threads of harmony, weaving between the clinks of silverware and the hum of casual voices. Willa returned with the pot. When she reached Boone's table, she paused, lifted the pot, and leaned slightly. "Warm up," she asked, eyes fixed on the mug. Boone didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood. Not abruptly. Not for drama. He pushed his hands against the table, rose slowly to his full height, and turned to face her directly. The diner went quiet, not suddenly, but as though someone had gently laid a hand across the room. Chairs shifted less. Forks halted midair. Even the gospel on the radio seemed to dip lower, receding behind breath and stillness. Boone placed his heels together, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand to his brow. It was a formal salute, one practiced so many times it carried its own memory. His hand remained there for a moment longer than necessary. Willa blinked once. Her mouth did not open. Her back did not straighten further. But something in her chest moved just beneath the uniform, past the cardigan behind the faded scar that no longer needed explanation. Boone's voice, when it came, was quiet but strong enough for all to hear. This woman rerouted Bravo 6 10 minutes before detonation. My men are alive because of her. He placed a small worn envelope on the table. No one reached for it. Willa didn't touch it. Mr. Clyde, who had just finished restocking the napkins at the front counter, stopped mid-step. He cleared his throat softly once and didn't move again. Someone in the corner stood, an older man in a navy blazer with medals pinned not for show but for memory. He didn't say anything, just stood and nodded once in Willa's direction. At a booth near the window, a woman whispered, "I had no idea." Boone gave no further speech. He turned, buttoned his coat, and walked out, nodding once to Clyde on his way past the register. The door swung shut behind him. Willa remained standing, her eyes lowered to the envelope on the table. Carefully, she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a black and white photo, edges soft with time. 6 men boots in red dust grins, crooked and tired helmets off. In the center stood Boone, younger, sharper hand resting on the shoulder of a woman, face in profile, hair tucked back under a helmet. On the back, written in pen, "We thought we lost her." Willa folded the photo, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it into her apron pocket, the one where the purple ribbon still lived, just barely visible. She turned. Casey stood behind the counter, eyes wide, hand still resting on the coffee carafe she hadn't picked up. "Ma'am," she said softly, voice uncertain. "Was that really you?" Some folks had been coming to Dixie's for over 20 years, but not a single one had ever asked Willa Dean about the ribbon. The diner lights glowed low against the windows, casting soft gold across the empty booths. Outside, the street lamps hummed their steady amber, catching the breath of late November air as it curled into the narrow lanes of Franklin, Tennessee. Sunday had given up its noise, its church shoes and whispered prayers, leaving only silence and the slow toll of the church bell at 8 o'clock. Inside, Willa wiped down the counter with slow, even strokes. The chairs were flipped, the floors mopped, the register closed. But she lingered. The ribbon was still in her pocket. Not hidden, but not quite displayed. Her fingers brushed it once briefly as she passed the stack of clean mugs. The envelope Boone had left, now a little bent at the corners, sat beside her coffee pot. She hadn't moved it since morning. Casey leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed over her apron. The usual bounce in her step had vanished sometime between breakfast and closing, replaced now by a hesitation she couldn't quite swallow. "I should have seen it," she said finally. Willa didn't turn. "I mean, I looked right past it. Past you. I didn't want to see it." Casey's voice wasn't loud. She wasn't trying to make a speech. It was easier, pretending you were just quiet. Willa finished rinsing a cloth, wrung it out, folded it in half. She set it neatly on the edge of the sink. Then, without a word, she opened the cooler, took out a small pie tin, and placed it gently on the counter. "Pecan," she said. "Still good." Casey blinked. "You want two?" But Willa was already cutting 2 slices, placing them on mismatched plates. She handed one over without looking up. They sat in silence. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once. The street outside stayed empty. Later, Willa climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the pharmacy. The key turned with a click she knew by heart. Her cat Moxie wound around her ankles once before hopping up to the windowsill. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and something older books maybe, or quilted fabric that had known better decades. A wall clock ticked patiently above the tiny kitchen table. On the far wall, a framed piece of cross-stitch read, "Strength is quiet." Willa took off her coat, laid it carefully across the back of the chair, and sat down. The envelope lay on the table. She hesitated only a moment this time before opening it. Inside, the same photo she'd glimpsed that morning. Boone's Unit 6 men smiling exhausted dust in every crease. One of them had his arm slung over another's shoulder. Boone stood to the side, face half-shadowed by his helmet. Willa recognized the back of her own head, the slope of her posture, even under gear. There was more now. A folded scrap of the same map Boone had studied, creases worn deep, and in the corner the initials WD circled in pencil. And a note, handwritten in the clean, deliberate script of a man used to filling out reports. "Because of you, I met my granddaughter. Thank you for the silence you carried." Her hand trembled slightly. She placed the photo beside the letter, the map on top. For a moment the room seemed to narrow as if folding in around memory. Then, softly, without sobs, without sound, Willa began to weep. Not as someone broken, but as someone released. Moxie leapt down and settled by her feet. Outside, the wind nudged the shutters once. A porch light flickered. Across the street, an elderly neighbor in a tan cardigan passed by on his evening walk and raised a hand in wordless greeting. Willa lifted hers in return. She didn't sleep much that night. The sky turned charcoal, then blue. And the next morning, when she stepped into Dixie's diner before sunrise, she pinned the ribbon fully outside her pocket for the first time. On Wednesday morning, the smell of cinnamon rolls and turkey broth filled the diner, but the biggest change was that someone said Willa's name. It was early, but not dark. The sky over Franklin carried the muted silver of a day between storms. Children in bright jackets darted past the window, chasing imaginary games down Main Street as the cold wind spun leaves in quiet circles at their feet. Inside Dixie's diner, the air was thick with nutmeg roasted garlic and the faintest hum of Harvest Moon playing over the radio. Willa stepped through the back door, hung her coat, and opened her locker. The usual things were there: folded apron-worn notebook, a paperclip chain from a slow shift last spring. And something new, a potholder hand-stitched in deep plum thread. The word respect curved slightly across the center, slightly uneven but clearly deliberate. No note. She held it for a moment, thumb brushing the fabric. Then she placed it gently beside her apron. When she stepped out to the counter, her eyes flicked toward the register. The ribbon was no longer in her pocket. It now sat framed behind the counter in a small, clean case, simple, unadorned. Beside it, a tiny flag pin had been added, its brass edges catching the light. It hadn't been there last night. Mr. Clyde stood at the grill flipping turkey sausage links without looking up. When Willa raised an eyebrow in his direction, he only shrugged, then returned to stacking toast. Casey hovered near the silverware tray, pretending to sort forks. Her shoulders gave her away. By mid-morning, the diner had filled with familiar faces. An older couple in matching flannel jackets sat near the front window, splitting a cinnamon bun between them. A boy with ruddy cheeks sat beside his grandfather at the counter, swinging his legs and asking questions about pie flavors. Someone called across the room, "Thank you for your service, Miss Dean." Willa turned slightly. It came from a man she'd seen for years, but never really spoken to one of those folks who nodded and paid exact change without comment. She nodded back, slow, unsure. Later, while sliding a fresh refill toward a booth, another patron, a woman in her 70s with a red scarf tied neatly at her neck, smiled and said, "Thank you, ma'am." The word caught gently in the air, like the first snowflake of a coming storm. Willa didn't respond aloud, but she tucked a napkin neatly beside the woman's plate just so, and moved on. Around 10, Boone came in. He didn't sit. He stepped just inside the door, his coat collar pulled high and his expression soft. Just wanted to say he said, eyes catching Willa's for a second, that pie saved my day. Just like someone once did. Willa didn't smile exactly, but her mouth curved slightly and her hand reached beneath the counter to pull a small to-go box. She slid it across the counter with practiced grace. "On the house," she said. Boone tipped his cap and left. By evening, the rush had thinned. The last of the plates had been cleared. The pie crusts for tomorrow rested on the windowsill to cool their buttery scent, curling into the corners of the quiet diner. Willa and Casey sat across from each other in a booth near the back, 2 mugs of cooling coffee between them. The radio had gone silent for a moment, the static soft. Casey looked up. "You don't have to." "I was in Kandahar," Willa said, voice low. November 2011. We were watching patterns. Communications intercepts roadside activity. I made 1 call. 6 men lived. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Casey didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on her mug, her fingers tracing the rim. After a pause, Willa added, not bitterly, "You didn't know. Most people don't ask." On Thanksgiving morning, Willa arrived before sunrise, and for the first time in years, she didn't unlock the diner alone. Fog clung to the windows of Dixie's like a curtain not yet drawn soft and silver in the pre-dawn light. The streets of Franklin were hushed, dressed in layers of muted amber and pale gray, as if the town itself hadn't quite woken. Somewhere nearby, a turkey was already roasting, and the scent of wood smoke teased the edges of the air. Willa stepped onto the curb at 5:58 a.m., scarf tucked around her neck, steam rising gently from the mug she carried from home. The diner windows glowed faintly, lights already on, and taped to the glass door was a handwritten note in Mr. Clyde's unmistakable block letters, "Let her rest. Coffee's on me today." But Willa smiled just a little and pushed the door open anyway. Casey was behind the counter balancing 2 trays of cinnamon rolls. "I figured you'd show up," she said, not turning. Willa removed her coat, smoothed her apron, and nodded. The ribbon was pinned plainly above her heart now. No longer a question, no longer hidden. Just a quiet fact. Inside, the diner had changed, not much, just enough. Hand-cut paper leaves in autumn colors dangled from the front window. A sign above the pie case read, "Gratitude served warm." The radio hummed softly with a piano version of America the Beautiful. The smell of maple syrup and bacon laced the air. Veterans filled the booths early, some in faded jackets with patches, others in flannel and work boots. They came for the food, sure, but also for each other. Mr. Clyde moved among them with 2 coffee pots alternating between regular and decaf, like a man who'd done this 100 Thanksgivings before. Willa worked through the rush quick and silent. Her motions were the same, but her presence felt different acknowledged. A neighbor waved as she passed, another squeezed her shoulder briefly when handing back a plate. Later, as the plates dwindled and the chatter softened, Casey nudged a chair beside the window. "Sit," she said. "Even machines get to rest." Willa hesitated. Then slowly she sat. Someone passed a bowl of mashed potatoes her way. Clyde slid a plate in front of her with a grunt that meant you've earned it. Casey cracked a joke about gravy being its own food group. Someone laughed. Outside, the fog had lifted. Near the end of the meal, the door opened again. A young woman stepped in her coat still dusted with cold air. She carried a toddler on her hip, a boy with bright eyes and a crayon-smudged drawing clutched in one hand. "Are you Miss Willa Dean?" she asked, her voice soft. Willa nodded, puzzled. "My grandpa talks about you," the woman said, "every time he visits. He couldn't make it today, but he wanted his grandson to say thank you." "To the lady with the ribbon." The boy squirmed until his feet hit the floor. He stepped forward and held out the picture. It was a stick figure, lopsided and cheerful, with a splash of purple over the heart and a smile too big for the round head. Willa took it, kneeling slightly to the boy's height. "Well," she said, voice thick with something that didn't quite reach tears, "this is just perfect." The boy grinned. His mother mouthed thank you and guided him back to the door. A few minutes later, Willa rose from her seat. She crossed behind the counter to the small space beside the framed ribbon. And without ceremony, she taped the drawing to the wall just beside it. No speech, no gesture, only a quiet nod. She poured herself one last mug of coffee and returned to her spot at the end of the counter. Outside, a man walking his dog paused by the window. His eyes moved from the drawing to the ribbon to the woman behind the counter. He smiled. Not broadly, not knowingly, just a smile. And inside, Willa sipped her coffee, the ribbon catching morning light with no need to hide. Even in a small town where everyone thinks they know each other, some stories are carried quietly folded between morning routines and half-finished cups of coffee. Willa Dean never asked to be seen, but kindness has a way of making itself visible often when we least expect it. Sometimes all it takes is a simple gesture, a salute, a slice of pie, a child's drawing to remind us that worth isn't worn on the face, but lived in quiet choices. Like a porch light left on for someone coming home late, compassion doesn't need to be loud to be lasting, and maybe the next time we pass someone by, we'll pause just long enough to see them.